They gave her a mop. They thought she was a joke. But the woman they mocked was the ghost who built the very cage they couldn't open. In a hangar full of arrogance and war machines, she walked in. Blonde, quiet, nameless. No rank, no tools. Just eyes that saw deeper than steel, that could read the hidden language of systems others couldn't even comprehend. By the time she left, the room stood in silence. The mission was saved, and the loudest man in the room had learned to listen. This is not a story about hardware. It's about the mind behind the silence, the brilliance that whispers while ignorance shouts, and the moment when assumptions crumble like paper in the wind. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the cavernous hangar, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor. In the corner, a weapons cage stood like a steel fortress, its electronic locks glowing red with defiance. For 3 hours, the squadron's best had thrown everything at it. Code breakers hunched over their laptops, sweat beading on their foreheads. Engineers traced wiring diagrams with trembling fingers. The weapons inside remained locked away, mocking their efforts. But then, she appeared. A young woman stepped through the hangar doors, her blonde hair catching the industrial light. She wore nothing special, just a plain blue jumpsuit without rank, without insignia, without identity. To most eyes, she looked like maintenance staff, someone who'd wandered into the wrong building at the wrong time. Master Sergeant Riggs spotted her first. His weathered face twisted into a sneer, the kind of expression that came naturally after 20 years of military service. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Lost your way to the kitchen?" The squadron erupted in laughter, a chorus of masculine mockery that echoed off the hangar walls. She said nothing. Not a word. Not even a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Riggs strutted over, his boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. He grabbed the industrial mop from a nearby bucket, water still dripping from its strings. "Here," he said, shoving the handle toward her chest. "Make yourself useful while the real soldiers work." More laughter, crude comments, the kind of harassment that happened when men thought they were safe in their pack mentality. But from his elevated position in the observation booth, Colonel Martinez watched through the reinforced glass. Something about the woman's grip on that mop handle made him lean forward. She didn't hold it like someone resigned to cleaning duty. Her fingers wrapped around the metal shaft with purpose, with control, like a martial artist gripping a staff, like someone who understood leverage and balance, and the precise application of force. The woman began to mop, but this wasn't the lazy back-and-forth motion of someone killing time. Every stroke was deliberate, calculated. She moved in patterns that seemed random to the untrained eye, but held a mathematical precision that spoke of deep training. Her feet found positions that maximized efficiency while minimizing effort. Each motion flowed into the next like water following an ancient riverbed. And her eyes kept drifting to the weapons cage. The code breakers continued their frantic typing. Circuit diagrams rustled as engineers searched for bypass points. Failure after failure mounted like fallen soldiers on a battlefield, but she mopped around them all, silent as a ghost, invisible as air. Colonel Martinez pressed his palm against the observation window. Something was wrong with this picture. Her steps made no sound on the wet concrete, not even the whisper of rubber soles or the soft splash of moisture. She moved through the chaos like smoke, and her posture, it was too straight, too controlled. This wasn't the slouch of a janitor. This was the bearing of someone who'd been trained to kill. "Status report," the colonel barked into his microphone, his voice booming through the hangar speakers. The lead engineer looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, we've tried everything. Electromagnetic pulse, frequency modulation, even attempted to override the main circuit board. Nothing's working." Master Sergeant Riggs kicked a toolbox in frustration, sending wrenches scattering across the floor. Then his eyes fell on the woman, still mopping in her quiet, methodical way. "You," he shouted, pointing at her, like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. "Stop playing janitor and make yourself useful. Do something." She stopped mopping. The wet strings dripped once, twice, then went still. She walked toward the weapons cage, but not with the tools, not with the laptops, not with any of the sophisticated equipment that littered the floor around her. She approached with nothing but her bare hands, her steps now deliberate and purposeful. The entire hangar fell silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz more quietly. She stood before the cage and tilted her head, listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Her fingers traced the air near the lock mechanism, not quite touching, feeling for invisible vibrations, electromagnetic fields, the subtle hum of electronic components. Then she began to tap, tap, a soft percussion against a seemingly random point on the frame. Tap. Another strike, this time 3 inches to the left. Tap. Her knuckles found pressure points on the metal that shouldn't have existed, spots where the cage's structural integrity created resonance points invisible to conventional detection. The red lights on the electronic locks flickered. No one breathed. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its mechanical respiration. She struck one final hidden point, her knuckle connecting with a soft metallic ping that rang through the hangar like a bell. The cage unlocked. The red lights vanished as if they'd never existed. The steel bars retracted with a soft hydraulic whisper. Inside, rows of advanced weaponry gleamed under the fluorescent light, no longer prisoners behind electronic bars. Colonel Martinez's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, ceramic shattering against the observation booth floor. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the hangar, every word carried like thunder. T0 protocol. He paused, his eyes wide with recognition and something that looked like fear. I haven't seen that technique in 20 years. The woman set down her mop, the handle clicking softly against the concrete. For the first time since entering the hangar, she looked up at the observation booth. Her eyes met the colonel's through the reinforced glass, and in that moment, he knew exactly who she was. And more importantly, he knew why she was here. The hangar remained frozen in time, as if the very air had crystallized around this impossible moment. Master Sergeant Riggs stood like a statue, his mouth still hanging open, his brain struggling to process what his eyes had just witnessed. The code breakers had stopped typing entirely, their fingers hovering over keyboards that suddenly seemed as primitive as stone tools. Engineers clutched their circuit diagrams like children holding security blankets, their expertise rendered meaningless by 3 simple taps. Colonel Martinez's hands trembled as he reached for his secure phone. His fingers, steady enough to sign deployment orders that sent men into combat, now shook as he dialed the classified personnel database. I need a full background check, he said, his voice barely controlled. Priority Alpha clearance. Subject is... He paused, realizing he didn't even know her name. The response came faster than it should have, faster than any normal database query. The communications officer's voice crackled through the secure line, and even through the electronic distortion, Martinez could hear the man's shock. Sir, her file is... A long pause. It's almost completely redacted, Colonel. Everything's blacked out except for a single code name. What code name? Chimera. The word hit Martinez like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers of that designation in the deepest corridors of the Pentagon. Rumors spoken in hushed tones by generals who'd seen too much classified material. But he'd never believed the stories were real. There's one more thing, sir, the communications officer continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Just one line of clearance information. It says lead design architect, field implementation level Onyx. The phone slipped from Martinez's hand, clattering against the observation booth's metal desk. Level Onyx. The highest classification the military had, reserved for projects so sensitive that their very existence was denied by 3 different government agencies. And if she was the lead design architect, the realization hit him like lightning splitting a tree. She hadn't broken into the weapons cage. She hadn't bypassed its security or found some overlooked vulnerability in its design. The truth was far more extraordinary and terrifying. She had built it. Every circuit, every pressure point, every hidden resonance frequency that she'd just exploited with her bare hands. She hadn't spoken to the cage like a burglar coaxing open a lock. She had communicated with it like a parent calling to their child, using a language she had written herself, embedded in steel and silicon and electromagnetic fields. She didn't bypass the lock. She had authored its very existence. Down on the hangar floor, Master Sergeant Riggs felt his world collapsing around him like a controlled demolition. 20 years of service, 20 years of believing he understood the chain of command, the hierarchy of expertise, the natural order of military life, his technical pride, his assumption that experience and rank meant something, his casual dismissal of anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of a soldier, all of it crumbled to dust in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The stripes on his uniform suddenly felt like children's stickers. His years of training seemed like finger painting compared to the masterpiece he'd just witnessed. He had handed a mop to someone who could probably redesign the entire base's defense systems using nothing but the metal in her jumpsuit zipper. Colonel Martinez descended from the observation booth, his footsteps echoing through the cathedral silence of the hangar. When he reached the main floor, something unprecedented happened. Something that would be talked about in military circles for decades to come. He didn't salute her with his hand. Protocol and tradition demanded a hand salute between officers. But this moment transcended protocol. Instead, Colonel Martinez, a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers across 3 combat deployments, came to attention. His spine straightened to perfect vertical alignment, his chin lifted, his eyes focused straight ahead in the most formal military bearing possible. It was the kind of respect reserved for the flag, for fallen comrades, for moments when the weight of service becomes too sacred for casual gestures. The entire hangar watched in stunned silence as their commanding officers showed deference to a woman they had mocked just minutes before. Then Martinez turned slowly toward Master Sergeant Riggs, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority and hard-earned wisdom. Sometimes, he said, each word falling into the silence like stones into still water, the person holding the mop is the only one worth following. The words hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Riggs felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, a tectonic plate of understanding grinding against years of assumptions. The other soldiers stood motionless, processing this moment that would reshape how they viewed leadership, expertise, and the dangerous habit of judging others by their appearance. Within hours, the story began to spread, first through the base, then to other installations, carried by encrypted communications and whispered conversations in mess halls across the country. But as stories do when they travel through military channels, it evolved, gathered weight, became something larger than the sum of its parts. They called it the Morgan Protocol, named after the base where it happened. Not the incident itself, but the lesson it taught. The understanding that true expertise often comes disguised as something ordinary, that the most dangerous operative might be the one you least suspect, and that sometimes the greatest display of power is the quiet competence that needs no announcement. The Morgan Protocol became military legend, a reminder that in a world of high-tech warfare and complex systems, the most sophisticated weapon of all might just be the human mind that designed everything else. And somewhere in that hangar, a mop lay forgotten on the concrete floor, witness to the moment when everything changed. But change, real change, doesn't announce itself with fanfare or victory parades. It settles into the bones of a place like morning mist, quiet and inevitable. Dr. Morgan, for that was her name, though few would ever learn it, simply walked back to the weapons cage as if nothing extraordinary had happened. No acknowledgement of the stares that followed her every movement. No pause for the applause that never came because everyone was still too stunned to remember how to clap. She stepped inside the cage with the casual familiarity of someone entering their own home. Her fingers began to dance across the control panels, running diagnostics on systems that bore her invisible signature. Each touch was purposeful, each gesture born from intimate knowledge of circuits and pathways that existed nowhere in any manual. She moved through the electronic maze like water finding its way downhill, following paths of least resistance that only she could see. The soldiers watched from outside the cage, their earlier mockery now replaced by something approaching reverence. They observed her hands moving across surfaces they had studied for hours without understanding, watching her communicate with machines in a language they didn't know existed. And then, in the lower left corner of the main housing unit, her fingers paused. She had found something. A microscopic fracture in the metal casing, invisible to the naked eye, undetectable by their conventional scanning equipment. A flaw so small it would have taken months of normal operation to manifest into actual system failure. But she saw it immediately, the way a composer might hear a single flat note in a symphony, the way a master chef could taste when salt was missing from a complex sauce. She made a note in her mental catalog and continued her inspection, leaving the soldiers to wonder what other hidden vulnerabilities existed in systems they had trusted with their lives. When her work was complete, she walked toward the hangar exit with the same quiet purpose that had marked her entrance. No goodbye, no explanation, no lingering to bask in the recognition that now followed her like sunlight. She simply gathered her things and headed for the door, as if unlocking impossible security systems was just another Tuesday afternoon task. But before she could reach the exit, footsteps echoed behind her. Running footsteps, urgent and breathless. She turned to see a young airman, barely old enough to shave, his face flushed with exertion and something that looked like desperation. He was one of the ones who had laughed earlier, one of the voices in that chorus of mockery that had greeted her arrival. He skidded to a stop in front of her, his words tumbling out in a rush of curiosity and shame. "Ma'am, I have to ask, how did you know those exact taps, those precise points on the cage? How did you know where to strike?" For the first time since entering the hangar, her expression softened. A faint smile touched the corners of her mouth, the kind of expression a teacher might wear when a student finally asks the right question. When she spoke, her voice carried the warmth of someone sharing a secret that wasn't really secret at all, just overlooked. "The designer always leaves a key under the mat," she said, her words measured and gentle. "You just have to know which house you're visiting." The airman nodded as if he understood, though the deeper meaning would take him years to fully grasp. She was talking about more than security systems or hidden access points. She was describing a philosophy of creation, the idea that true architects always embed pathways for those who come after, hidden solutions for problems not yet encountered. The next morning arrived with the precision of military routine, but something fundamental had shifted in the base's atmosphere. Respect, which had been earned through rank and longevity, now carried a different weight. Orders were still followed, but questions were welcome. Assumptions were challenged rather than accepted as gospel. The change radiated outward from that hangar like ripples in a pond, touching every corner of the installation. It became policy without ever being written down, a cultural transformation that happened one conversation at a time, one moment of humility at a time. Weeks passed, and the transformation in Master Sergeant Riggs became the most visible symbol of this new era. The man who had once commanded through volume and intimidation now listened with the intensity he had previously reserved for shouting. He invited opinions from soldiers he would have dismissed before, sought input from specialists whose expertise he had been too proud to acknowledge. When new personnel arrived at the base, Riggs would inevitably bring them to the weapons cage during their orientation. He would point to the spot where everything had changed, his voice dropping to almost a whisper as he shared the story. "That's the Morgan point," he would say, using the phrase that had become shorthand for the moment when assumptions collapsed and wisdom revealed itself. "Remember it. Remember that competence doesn't always announce itself with noise." His transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. The loudness that had defined his leadership style died that day in the hangar, but from its ashes emerged something far more powerful. His authority now came not from the volume of his voice, but from the depth of his humility, his willingness to admit that 20 years of experience could be trumped by knowledge he hadn't known existed. Dr. Morgan never returned to the base. Her work, whatever it had been, was complete. But the way she had carried that mop, the dignity she had maintained in the face of mockery, the quiet competence that needed no announcement, these became the foundation of a new leadership philosophy that spread far beyond the walls of that single installation. Her silence had proven more powerful than any order ever issued. Her competence had left a mark more lasting than any medal or commendation. And in the end, the legend of the Morgan Protocol wasn't really about advanced security systems or classified operations. It was about the revolutionary idea that true strength whispers, while weakness shouts, that the most dangerous person in any room might be the one holding the mop, and that sometimes the greatest display of power is knowing exactly when not to use it. The mop itself was eventually moved to a place of honor in the base museum, though few visitors understood why a simple cleaning tool deserved such reverence. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the moment when everything changed, It served as a reminder that legends aren't always born in battle. Sometimes they're born in the quiet moments between heartbeats, when someone who could reshape the world chooses instead to simply clean the floor, waiting patiently for the moment when their true capabilities would be needed most. She never raised her voice, not once during that entire encounter. She never explained herself or demanded recognition for her extraordinary abilities. She didn't need to justify her presence or defend her qualifications to men who couldn't comprehend the depth of her expertise. Her silence spoke volumes that words could never convey. Because quiet doesn't mean weak. And a mop, when placed in the right hands, can break open the strongest steel, unlock the most sophisticated systems, and reshape the fundamental assumptions of everyone watching. Doctor, Morgan was never just a woman in a blue jumpsuit wandering into the wrong building at the wrong time. She was the brilliant mind behind the very machines that had confounded an entire squadron of trained specialists. She was the architect of systems so advanced that their creators had to embed secret pathways for maintenance and emergency access. She was the living embodiment of the principle that true power often hides behind the most ordinary appearances. The greatest lessons in leadership, in humility, in recognizing the extraordinary within the mundane, these are always whispered rather than shouted. They settle into our consciousness like seeds planted in fertile soil, growing slowly but inevitably into wisdom that changes how we see the world around us. So the next time someone walks into your workplace quietly, carrying nothing but simple tools and wearing clothes that don't announce their importance, you might want to listen before you laugh. You might want to observe before you judge. Because in a world where the loudest voices often carry the least substance, the whispered truths have the power to unlock everything we thought we knew about strength, competence, and the dangerous habit of underestimating others. The Morgan Protocol lives on not as a military regulation or technical procedure, but as a reminder that excellence rarely announces itself with fanfare. It shows up for work, does what needs to be done, and leaves behind a legacy that echoes long after the last footstep has faded from memory.